American tariffs on China and China tariffs on America in 2025. America's 2025 tariff strategy. In 2025, the global economy stood at a crossroads. Inflation was slowing, artificial intelligence was reshaping industry, and electric vehicles were becoming the new oil. The United States, still recovering from past trade shocks and pandemic-induced fractures, made a bold move. Not with a speech, not with a missile, but with a tariff. It began quietly in March. A press release from the U.S. Trade Representative's office announced sweeping new tariffs: 30% duties on Chinese-made electric vehicles, 25% on advanced semiconductors, and a sharp hike on solar technology components. The justification? National security concerns. But the message was louder than the numbers. America was drawing a new line. Washington accused China of economic manipulation, cyber espionage, and flooding global markets with state-backed tech. Behind the scenes, the decision wasn't just about trade, it was political. The 2024 elections had brought in a new administration, one that campaigned on rebuilding American industry, protecting domestic innovation, and confronting what it called unfair Chinese dominance. For months leading up to the decision, lobbying groups, labor unions, and Silicon Valley giants had been pressing for change. Chinese EVs, often undercutting U.S. prices by 40%, were gaining ground. American tech companies accused Chinese firms of copying designs and bypassing patents. And in the halls of Congress, voices grew louder, demanding action before America's manufacturing base became a memory. The new tariffs were not symbolic. They were surgical. By targeting industries at the heart of China's 21st century economy, AI chips, EV batteries, and solar cells, the U.S. had taken aim at Beijing's most prized ambitions: green energy dominance and technological supremacy. The markets reacted immediately. Chinese stocks took a dip. American automakers rose. But beneath the surface, tensions simmered. CEOs worried about higher costs. Economists warned of another trade spiral. And in Beijing, leaders held emergency meetings to plan their response. But Washington didn't flinch. Officials doubled down in press conferences. "This is not about starting a war," one trade advisor said. "It's about defending our future." Yet history had already shown what comes next. Tariffs never land alone. They echo, they ripple, and they return. By the end of April, port authorities on both coasts began reporting delays. U.S. importers scrambled to find alternative suppliers. Chinese exporters looked to Europe and Latin America. The world, once again, was bracing for a storm that started with numbers on paper, but could change the shape of global trade. The first move had been made. Quiet, calculated, and controversial. But as history reminds us, when giants trade blows, it's not just steel and silicon that shake. It's the entire balance of power. China strikes back, retaliation with precision. When China responded, it didn't scream. It calculated. Beijing didn't match the American tariffs headline for headline. It studied the chessboard. Then, with precision, made its move. On May 10, 2025, the Chinese Ministry of Commerce released a statement. It declared new tariffs of up to 35% on key American exports: soybeans, aerospace components, and liquid natural gas. But this wasn't just about dollar value. It was about targeting the pressure points. China hit the heartland, U.S. farmers who depended on Chinese buyers. It hit Silicon Valley's hardware, aerospace firms that supplied crucial systems to commercial and defense clients. And it struck energy, leveraging America's growing reliance on LNG exports to Asia. Within hours, the ripple began. Midwest farmers stared at plummeting crop prices. Aircraft suppliers saw contracts freeze. Energy analysts warned of reduced demand. The retaliation was not random. It was strategic. But tariffs weren't the only card China played. It launched subsidies, quietly, to protect its own industries. Electric vehicle producers received government guarantees to shield them from falling demand. Semiconductor firms got tax breaks and soft loans. China's message to its business community was clear: hold the line. Meanwhile, the narrative war began. State-run media flooded channels with a single theme: China is not the aggressor, but it will not be bullied. The story painted the U.S. as unstable, unpredictable, and unwilling to follow international rules. Chinese citizens rallied online. Hashtags trended. National pride surged. Western analysts noticed something else. China didn't apply tariffs to U.S. pharmaceuticals or aircraft maintenance parts, both sectors it still depended on. That wasn't an oversight. It was restraint. A quiet reminder that China knew the limits and played for the long game. Then came the global stage. At the World Trade Organization in Geneva, China filed a formal complaint, accusing the U.S. of violating fair trade norms. Behind closed doors, Chinese diplomats spoke with leaders from Europe, Africa, and South America, offering trade deals, soft loans, and infrastructure investment. Beijing wasn't just reacting. It was repositioning. While media focused on tariffs, another shift occurred. China accelerated its trade talks with Brazil, Russia, and the ASEAN bloc. By July, it had signed 2 regional agreements that reduced reliance on American markets altogether. For Beijing, the goal was clear: absorb the hit, redirect the flow, and come back stronger. But retaliation, even strategic, has a cost. China's export sector slowed. Small factories faced order cancellations. Ports operated below capacity. Job losses were reported in industrial zones. Still, the government absorbed the pain, confident in its planning. This wasn't a trade war like 2018. This was smarter, sharper, quieter. America had made its move. China had responded. But the game was far from over. Because the real impact, the real suffering, wasn't in boardrooms or government halls. It was waiting, in cargo ships stuck at sea, in unsold soybeans, in factories running cold. And soon, both nations would begin to feel it. The economic battlefield, industry, consumers, and the chaos. Tariffs are announced by governments, but they're paid by people. By summer 2025, the U.S.-China tariff war had entered a new phase, no longer about headlines or strategy, but about damage. Real, measurable, unavoidable damage. In America's heartland, the consequences were immediate. Farmers in Iowa and Kansas watched grain storage overflow. Soybeans once bound for Shanghai were now sitting unsold, prices falling fast. The Chinese market, once their largest buyer, had closed its gates. Some farmers took out emergency loans. Others didn't plant at all. Meanwhile, in Detroit and Ohio, auto factories slowed production. Electric vehicle makers, once riding the wave of demand, now struggled with rising costs. Chinese-made lithium batteries and rare earth materials had become too expensive under the new tariffs. American EVs got pricier. Sales dipped. Assembly lines paused. Layoffs began. On the Chinese side, industrial cities like Shenzhen and Guangzhou felt the shock. Small manufacturers, the silent force behind China's export machine, started to collapse. Orders from the U.S. had dried up. Factories ran on half shifts. Workers returned home, uncertain if their jobs would ever return. Even tech giants weren't safe. Semiconductor firms in both countries faced delays. Raw materials became harder to source. Prices spiked. Chip shortages returned, slowing down everything from smartphones to data centers. But it wasn't just companies. It was families. In the U.S., electronics, appliances, and clothing all saw price hikes. A smartphone that once cost $799 now listed at $899. Parents hesitated before upgrading school tablets. Retailers warned of tariff-adjusted pricing ahead of the holiday season. At gas stations and grocery stores, inflation quietly crept back in. Chinese households felt it too. American brands disappeared from store shelves. Some medicines and supplements became scarce. Online shoppers noticed fewer options, longer delivery times, and higher costs. The middle class, growing for decades, now faced stagnation. Both nations had underestimated one thing: how deeply intertwined their economies really were. Even as they tried to hurt each other, they were hurting themselves. To escape the spiral, companies looked for exits. Apple began shifting more assembly to India. Clothing brands explored factories in Vietnam. Some semiconductor plants relocated to Mexico. Diversification wasn't just strategy, it was survival. But not everyone could pivot. Small businesses, family farms, and mid-size manufacturers, they didn't have offshore options. They endured, cut costs, or shut down. Meanwhile, the world watched. Countries like Brazil and Indonesia filled trade gaps. European leaders called for neutrality. And in boardrooms worldwide, executives asked the same question: is this the new normal? The battlefield was no longer abstract. It had names, faces, and consequences. And as the trade war dragged on, it became clear. In this conflict, there were no victors, only survivors. The new normal, lessons, shifts, and what comes next. By late 2025, the battle had burned long enough to leave scars. What began as a trade maneuver had evolved into something bigger, a global reshuffling. Tariffs had disrupted industries, shocked supply chains, and sparked unintended transformations. But now, as the dust began to settle, a question emerged. What comes next? Quietly, away from the cameras, diplomats from both nations met in neutral Switzerland. There were no flags, no podiums, just private rooms and careful words. No major deals were struck, but small openings appeared. A commitment to keep rare earth exports flowing. A joint discussion on pharmaceuticals. A promise to prevent further escalation. The world didn't cheer, but it exhaled. Meanwhile, economies began to adapt. In the U.S., federal grants were funneled into semiconductor fabs in Arizona and Ohio. Made in America was no longer a slogan, it was policy. From clean energy to advanced chips, reshoring became the mission. Expensive, but essential. China responded in kind. Beijing unveiled new incentives to promote internal demand, fewer exports, more domestic growth. In place of lost American buyers, it turned to Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia. A new trade web began to take shape. By October, factories that had gone silent were beginning to hum again, not with the same old rhythms, but with new directions. American EV firms leaned into Canadian suppliers. Chinese tech companies launched partnerships in the Middle East. Vietnam, Mexico, and India saw a boom as global firms rerouted supply chains to avoid tariff zones. The war hadn't ended. It had simply changed. Economists stopped calling it a trade war. They called it decoupling, a polite way to describe a slow divorce between the world's two largest economies. But the truth was more complex. Despite the tariffs, trade didn't stop, it shifted. Loopholes were found. New intermediaries emerged. Parallel supply chains replaced direct ones. The world adjusted. And yet, the lessons were sharp. For America, the danger of overdependence became clear. For China, the risk of concentrated exports was undeniable. And for the rest of the world, the message was simple. In a global economy, when two giants clash, everyone shakes. But perhaps the biggest shift wasn't economic, it was psychological. Governments now thought twice before trusting a single partner. Consumers began to ask where their products really came from. And industries, once built for profit, now braced for resilience. By December 2025, the noise had faded. Headlines moved on. Stock markets stabilized. But beneath it all, something fundamental had changed. Not just who traded with whom, but how the world viewed trade itself. The tariffs didn't just raise prices. They rewrote the rules. And somewhere in the quiet aftermath, a new global order began to take shape. Because in the end, the tariff war didn't end with a treaty. It ended with a transformation.